Hello, this is Alex Burkett, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this episode, I'm chatting with Ethan Hayes. Ethan is the general manager of Moz and Stat Search Analytics. In 20 plus years working in SEO, Ethan is focused on technical SEO for large domains and media networks with clients like United Healthcare, Toyota, Valvoline, Spin Media, and Healthline.com. As a believer in making SEO accessible to everybody, he also consults with small business owners, solopreneurs, and creators on sustainable growth strategies. This conversation was awesome. We geeked out about enterprise SEO, including some of the softer side details about how to sell into the enterprise, how the enterprise makes decisions, and actually why enterprises typically underinvest in SEO despite having seemingly all the advantages to make it actually work. We also talked about the origins of Healthline. It's this behemoth now, but we talked about Ethan's early days, kind of building out the product-led SEO engine. And then we talked about SEO education, how we overcomplexify this stuff, making it seem like this black box, like this witchcraft. And actually, sometimes it's better to be simple in explaining this stuff. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Ethan Hayes. Tragedy of the commons. You're mentioning before we started recording the tragedy of the commons in relation to search and artificial intelligence and large language models. Can you continue here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that for folks who aren't familiar with the idea of the tragedy of the commons, it's that when you make a resource that is broadly helpful and available to a lot of people, inevitably there will be a certain number of bad actors who look to exploit that openness and this wide availability of this resource, and they want to sort of take more than their share. And eventually, when you get that happening enough, because I see this guy over here doing it, and maybe I should be doing that, so I double down on it ends up degrading the quality of the ecosystem, And so when I look at I've been in SEO for a long time, over 20 years. And I sort of look at the conversation and to a certain extent, like the way the conversation feels in SEO right now and over the past year or so, like Google's just been getting destroyed in public relations, right? Like everybody's like, oh, the search quality sucks. It's terrible. And then you start getting the conspiracy theories like why is Reddit all over the place when there's this financial deal between Reddit and Google and it's leading up to their IPO, and right, so everybody gets a little tinfoil hatty and everybody loves coming up with these ideas. I think that when we look at the changes that I've seen in the organic search ecosystem, especially over the last year and a half, it seems like Google has adopted a very sort of defensive posture to a certain extent, which is to say, you are seeing a drastic increase in large brands in search results that arguably have no business being there. Like personally for me, I see a site like Forbes. They have been a bad actor in the search space for over a decade.
Oh yeah.
Right? They're doing what they do. It is a viable strategy. They have this huge domain. It has all of this authority. You can kind of hang anything off it and you end up with first page rankings for best protein powders and all this stuff that just Forbes have no business talking about that stuff. And like we can all see that. And I think it pisses people off, rightly so, right? Like there are hardworking subject matter experts at a smaller scale who are getting decimated because Google seems interested in elevating these very large brands, even though I would argue that the EEAT of these brands relative to these topics is laughably small, right?
Or even like your sense of like topical authority, you're spread across so many niches. And then like Forbes ostensibly is like a financial publication, a business publication, right? You would expect it to be lifted for those things and then maybe not lifted for other things. It doesn't make sense in that lens.
Exactly. And so when you're seeing this sort of over and over and over again across all of these different domains, LinkedIn is getting really aggressive in this area. When I zoom out, I sort of look at that. I know that Google hates taking a bath in PR, right? They are sensitive to what the general tenor of the conversation is out there in the search space. And look no farther than a recent botched product launch in Gemini, where they brought a product to market. Oopsie, they apparently forgot to test it a whole lot. And everybody went in there and they started using it, and they had the reaction.
There's some hilarious examples, yeah.
Right? And they had the experiences that they had, and everybody started talking about it. And a huge chunk of Google's enterprise value was immediately impacted by their stock price going down, just on the fact that this was a huge PR loss for them, right? They are a huge public company. They have their fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders, and PR has a huge role to play in that. And generally, they're very good at PR. But when I see the overall conversation and the tenor of just being like, oh, Google sucks right now, they're doing everything wrong, blah, blah, blah. To me, as somebody who's been in this industry for a long time, it feels a lot like the same kind of criticism and conversation that was happening in, let's say, 2009, 2010, right? When you saw the first wave of the content farms, right? These were companies that were large, they were well-resourced, and they realized there's this loophole in the algorithm, and all we got to do is go out there and find a huge network of human writers who have sort of passing knowledge of these topics. We pay them $15 to write some janky article. You take this low value content, you hang it off a domain like eHow was sort of the primary culprit. And it was ranking like gangbusters, and it was all over the place. And you had Demand Media as the parent company going out into Wired, and they did this huge story about exactly how Demand Media was aligning all of their company and this entire operational process to do exactly this. They're like, we're going to create 1 billion of these articles, and we amortize the cost of creating each one of those pieces of content over an extremely long tail life cycle for that piece of content. And like the economics work out for us. And so they came out of this and they were looking awesome and super smart. And wow, they're doing all this stuff that nobody else is doing. And about 12, 14 months later, the Panda algorithm came out, right? Laser focused on those kinds of sites that were doing that kind of work that leads to the tragedy of the commons. They were polluting the search ecosystem with this really low value stuff. And all of a sudden Panda comes in and squashes it. I was working at a startup at the time that they had been extraordinarily successful in organic search. They were essentially an affiliate company that had taken VC investment. And because they had built such solid search fundamentals, their SEO traffic was just going up and to the right every single year. But the strategy that they used to deliver that growth was predicated on exactly the kinds of strategies that Panda was built to fight. We weren't creating any original content. We were scraping content and remixing it in ways that we thought, brought value to users. And so we could go, talk to our venture capital guys about how smart this strategy was. Panda came around and boom, literally overnight on all of the highest value, highest revenue pages, traffic just gone. right?
Yep.
And so I see those kinds of dynamics, and it feels sort of similar to me today, right? I think the quality of the SERPs, we're seeing way too many of these big brands getting attention despite some of their bad behavior. To me, and this is like a little bit of me putting on my tinfoil hat, I'm thinking of this from Google's perspective, and we know that philosophically Google has a soft spot for brands, right? I think about Eric Schmidt's quote when he was the CEO. He's like, brands are how you sort out the cesspool. Like, that always stuck in here. I'm like, that's very important. And so I think that brands in general feel like a bit of a safe space for Google because they know that organizations of this size do have skin in the game and do care about the long-term viability of their business. And so even if they're not doing the best stuff right now, over time, you can expect them to be good members of the sort of the broader search ecosystem. And so to me, that feeling of these big, somewhat questionable brands receiving way too much attention over the past, a year and a half in the face of all of this terrible publicity, I'm like, this seems like a protective measure where in the background, my guess is that whatever the option to over featuring brands, the other option is open the floodgates on the biggest tidal wave of LLM AI search spam we could possibly imagine, right?
Exactly.
And that's my guess. Like they're desperately trying to hold that back and figure out how to integrate it in a way that adds value, doesn't destroy their monetization model, makes users happy. And I think that's a really hard problem for them right now.
Well, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think that the lens that I'm seeing it through, and you've touched on this, is like from Google's perspective and even like a search experience standpoint, if you had to choose between false positives and false negatives, so false positives being like terrible results that creep through and pop up in the results versus false negatives, really good content that doesn't get surfaced, it's probably better to like have safe content. And maybe like the best content doesn't get serviced, but like the user never knows that. They don't know any better. They don't know that there's better content. They actually don't know. So like their satisfaction's still high versus like the floodgates being opened. You've got like tons and tons of chaos and a ton of bad experiences. I see why they're doing that right now. I think the frustrating thing is that the long arc of history hopefully trends towards like, good quality content and like, hopefully like Google's incentives are aligned with user incentives and creator incentives. But in the meantime, it seems like a lot of advice is very like hand wavy and it's like, well, become a brand, right? And it's like, how, like, like what does that mean? So is that like, if you're getting dominated by Forbes in these SERPs, like, is that the only play? Or like, what do you do if you're, basically like fighting this uphill battle? You're maybe not as well established. You don't have the click-through rates. You don't have the brand recognition. Like what does a challenger brand do?
Yeah. And that is a real challenge. That is a real challenge. Especially to me, one of the most interesting developments over the past year was really digging into all of the congressional testimony, right? Like Pandu Nayak, testifying in front of Congress, and just that layer of sort of understandable obfuscation that Google has, where for years they're talking about like, oh, click data is not important to us. It's easy to spam. Nobody cares about it. And then you get into their actual documents and they're like, the only reason that we have the advantage that we do is we have the most training data about what people actually click on and actually spend time on, which is, of course, the strongest user signal that exists. And they have the entire ecosystem built in such a way that they can see all of that. Of course, they're going to use it, right? So I think that when you see that and you realize the importance of building that data for your own domain, the old advice that I give that, I've given to a million people that I've had to practice as, somebody bringing a small domain into a really crowded space, like, healthline.com was a great example when it was a tiny little startup with 30 people in it. And we were up against WebMD and Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic and all of these sites that are just behemoths. For me, that strategy that you've heard so many times about long tail queries that are laser focused on exactly your customers, exactly the problems that they have, that's still a great strategy, right? If you are able to dig into those longer tail queries, find out where you're best going to be able to compete, and then start building that user data really around people finding your website and having positive experiences with it. That's the foothold, right? You have the build up from there is necessarily a long game.
Yeah, can you actually go a little bit more into this Healthline story? Because I saw your tweet about that, and that was super fascinating. I think it was in response to Lily Ray talking about like the roots of the site, and like somebody asking about like, oh, how is this like such a big presence now? And you had a couple lines. It was like, they were once a small blog too. They did SEO right. They played the long game. They stayed the course and still are. They put EAT at the forefront of their SEO approach from the start. And I think you said Healthline was getting 25,000 visits per month when you started, and then 3 million when you left. So like, give me some more details on that.
Yeah. So it was, I think it's my only guess as to why people responded to that so much is that it was a bit of a different perspective on what most folks would think of as today. If you are working in the health or medical information field, like you're going to be running face first into Healthline all over the place. Mm-hmm. It's been a while since I've looked at their traffic metrics. And of course, these are estimates. But on the organic search side, I think they're getting around 150 to 200 million search visits per month, right? Like they're a behemoth. That's the way that WebMD used to look 20 years ago. And so when you look at a domain like that, if you're in that field, you're running into Healthline every direction that you turn, and it can be demoralizing. It was demoralizing for me when I started at Healthline, and we're this tiny little startup, and we've got to fight against WebMD and Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic and all of these extremely authoritative sites that are building all their own original content. I think it's probably, my guess is that tweet resonated with people because they hadn't really thought of like the origin story of it. They just look at it today and they're like, it's huge, it's everywhere. It wasn't always that way, right? It was a tiny startup when I started. The focus of the company was completely different. They were not focused on being a content company at all. The original thesis for Healthline was that Google's health search results were not good enough because the field of health and medical information, it's the most complex domain that exists out there because dealing with the human body, it's the most complex machine that we're aware of. And so there's all of this complexity built into this. And they were like, having a generalist search engine in this area just doesn't make any sense compared to having a specialist search engine.
You were talking about Healthline's like sort of identification of the problem. The search results were bad.
So they came in as their stated goal was, we're going to build a health specific search engine. It's going to be the best in the world. And we're basically going to go head to head with Google. Wow. Big appetite, big strategy for the company. And of course they need traffic in order to do that. And when I came in to the website, as I mentioned, it was getting about 25,000 visits a month. It was all basically navigational queries, people who were trying to find Healthline. There's like a bunch of local phone telehealth services that are called Healthline. They were basically looking for that. That was the only traffic that we were getting. If you looked at the product itself, we were basically copying the Google user experience. It was just a page with a search bar and basically no way for a crawler to get into it and discover anything. Right. So like that was sort of the very beginning. And then the process was, okay, as we built out the search engine, as we built out these adjacent products that we want to bring to market, these health and medical information products, we're going to have to change that approach. That approach is going to require content. And so how do we bring content into our ecosystem in a way that is consistent with our stated brand purpose of bringing the very best and most trustworthy information to people that we possibly can? The folks at Healthline, a lot of the original founders and employees came from healthcare, came from consulting with healthcare practices. Like they really cared about building good, scientifically sound, trustworthy tools. And that's wonderful. That's a wonderful place to start from. Unfortunately, for Healthline at that time, they had no original content capability whatsoever. They had, from a previous iteration of Healthline, it was called Your Doctor. They had spent about $10 million in VC money writing original content, having doctors write original content. And that $10 million of original content was sat in dusty boxes in the closet and thumb drives. And it was just sitting there. And I was like, well, what a wonderful resource. All we have to do is take this stuff and, update it a little bit and get it back onto the website. It'll be wonderful. And we did the cost analysis, and it turned out that getting medical review of old content ends up being roughly the same cost as writing a net new piece of content that's medically vetted. And that was also very, very substantial. And we needed a comprehensive library of health and medical content that covered all of the common diseases and conditions, their symptoms, their treatments, all of that stuff. We needed it immediately, and it had to be medically sound, medically vetted, and reviewed. Because again, like the founders of the company were very concerned about making this information as high quality and as helpful as they possibly could. So the way that we did that was by licensing health and medical encyclopedias from Elsevier, from other large publishers. Quality of the content is wonderful, and they license it to hundreds of other websites that are in the same field. So if you have an article from the Adam Health Illustrated Encyclopedia about diabetes, wonderful, wonderful information, medically vetted, 350 other websites that include Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic have licensed that exact same content, and you're just never going to win, right? You're never going to win with it. So the challenge became, how can we build differentiated experience that delivers value to our users that other websites aren't delivering, given that we have this very serious content constraint? And so this brought us into the world of product-led SEO, because it's an engineering company, right? They're looking at these problems in really interesting ways. One of the things that we looked at from the keyword research in health and medical information, you tend to see extremely durable and repeatable patterns in those keywords. Everybody, the head term in any category is just the disease name. It's, diabetes. The second most search term in almost every common disease or condition is diabetes symptoms.
Yeah. So a lot of like patterns and templates.
And so what we looked at was, okay, if we know that people are interested in symptoms of diseases, might they also be interested in saying, here, if you're a hypochondriac, here's my laundry list of symptoms. What do I have? Right. They're really looking for it as almost a diagnostic tool. And so we built an application that was called Symptom Search. And Healthline, one of their core pieces of intellectual property was this medical ontology. They hired all kinds of medical informatics people and doctors and nurses and PhDs to create this structure that basically lined out the 3,500 most common diseases and conditions, all of their symptoms, all of their treatment options. And based on that ontology, we created this interface where somebody would come in and they'd enter their symptoms. They're like, I have a fever and I have red bumps on my skin. We would take those as inputs. We would run those against our medical ontology, and then we would do statistical models on top of that in terms of the relative disease prevalence of all of those things. And Symptom Search would come back to you with a rank ordered list of conditions that those symptoms might match. So fever and red bumps, chances are it's something like chickenpox, right? It's chickenpox, it's roseola, a skin condition. It could also be scarlet fever, but that's, relatively further down the list. And so in building this product, this was sort of the first one that really got to product market fit for us. And users just loved it. Everybody was all over it. And what it did as a result, it would surface excerpts. A results page for Symptom Search would surface excerpts from the medical encyclopedia content around each of those diseases and conditions. And in aggregate, when you looked at that page as a whole with these various snippets and Google's comparatively rudimentary handling of duplicate content at the time, those pages were unique enough that they got indexed in the hundreds of thousands, and the long tail traffic just started pouring in. And that was a revelation for us. We were like, oh shoot, this is a way that we can actually deliver on the company's mission, bring these tools to market that nobody else is doing, do it in a medically sound way. And with the content assets that we have, given that they're not perfect, they still build a unique enough page that gets us traffic, right? And so we really had to lean into product-led SEO because those were the tools that we had available to us.
That's such a cool story. And some of the, how you talked in the beginning about, people look at Healthline and they're like, how do I compete with them? I'm like, man, I worked at HubSpot and you have no idea how many people come to us and they're like, I want to compete with HubSpot. I'm like, it's like in jiu-jitsu, like a white belt being like, how do I compete with this black belt? It's like, you don't. They've been doing it for 15 or 20 years. You compete with the white belts. You learn from the black belt maybe, but it's like you're in different leagues right now.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And actually this kind of relates, but one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because you've got quite a bit of enterprise SEO experience. I found another tweet and I loved this one. So I have a two-part question here, but you talked about how SEO today still outperforms drastically all other channels in scalable business growth, delivering high intent visitors, and at high margin. And the second part you said was SEO also remains one of the most underinvested channels at Fortune 500, 110 companies that I've worked with. So that, to me, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but we work with a couple big brands, and it always shocks me at how immature the programs are compared with some earlier stage companies.
Yes.
And I'm perplexed. I'm like, why is that the case? Why is it underinvested in at the largest companies who presumably have the most advantages?
Yes.
The best foundations to actually compete, right?
That is a complex question. And a lot of factors play into it. The first one is it comes down to the most important thing. If you were at a large corporation, especially a public corporation, you realize what an incredible forcing function quarterly financial results are for the entire corporation, right? It's like those analyst calls, those can create or destroy billions of dollars in enterprise value just because you missed a target by this much. And so given that reality and the fact that a lot of large organizations have to have a bit of that short-term focus, like how are we doing against this quarter's, forecasts, when it comes to funding channels that could deliver growth, there is a mix of both the time frame and the ease of understanding. And when I say time frame, the way that I see this show up the most is your search team, paid and organic. They go in, they make their proposals, and basically, the CFO, the CEO says, okay, so you're saying that this SEO investment has huge strategic potential over the long term, can take us from here to here, can be very sustainable, but it comes with a lot of cost, right? You're going to have to be working with the product team, with the content team, with the engineering team, with QA, all of this. It comes with overhead attached to it. And what did you say the results are going to be at the end of that 12 months? And we as SEOs, fall back on the least satisfying answer, which is, it depends. Well, it depends.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of factors that go into it. Longer timeline, greater operational demand on the company to deliver that. They have to be patient, and the results are comparatively uncertain. If you have that next to but if you get the same, give the same $1 million to the paid search team, we can have traffic flowing in by this afternoon.
And they've already been doing it in many cases. So they already have some baseline data or historical data. So they can say, like, if you give us 20% more, we can project whatever more in results, right? You have the numbers.
100%. And so I think that if I zoom out and I think about over my 20-year career in SEO, like, what is the most common objection that I hear? And this is especially from young SEOs. It's always one thing. I'm so proud of the work I've done. I made these fantastic recommendations that could really move the needle for the company, and I can't get any resources, right? That seems to be, that was a problem 20 years ago when I started. That still seems to be a pronounced problem today. And so for me, the way around that has really been trying to reformulate how I talk to SEO, especially at very senior levels of the organization, in a way that is laser focused on exactly the things that they care about most, presented in the KPIs that are relevant to them as a business, and essentially trying to keep it simple, trying not to get into the detail, especially the technical detail, which, that part specifically is generally kryptonite in the boardroom.
We've learned that because you have the CRO background too. It's kind of like back when I was doing experimentation, it's like going to an executive and explaining the differences between like t-test and sequential testing or like, whatever statistics models. And they're like, what? How much money are we going to make? Like, what are you talking about?
Exactly. And so figuring it out, a lot of my focus, over the past 10 years, especially because, when the first dozen years that I had in Silicon Valley, it was a wonderful environment for an SEO because everybody's technology forward and data forward, and we want to try, innovative new stuff. And it was great. And, my joke in moving from San Francisco to New York was that getting on an airplane and flying to New York City was like getting on a time machine and going backwards about 10 years, right? Instead of having really interesting, strategic and technical discussions about how SEO could move a company forward, I found myself sitting in front of the CMO of a Fortune 500 company. And he starts off, he's like, so what is digital? You're like, oh God.
Yeah.
Oh, this is going to take a really long time, right? But it's like, you got to meet your customer where they are. And I realized that especially as you get into these very large organizations, in a lot of cases, they're barely aware of what their website is doing.
Totally.
Right? If you look at their entire revenue mix, their website is a fraction, and it therefore gets a fraction of that attention. And so in order to articulate the opportunity to grow that part of their business, first and foremost, you have to speak in the language that they care about. That is revenue, profit, the operational costs necessary to support that revenue and profit, and also figuring out a way to sort of zoom out of a lot of the technical complexity that we as SEOs live in on a day-to-day basis and figure out how to explain it as simply as I possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
And as silly as that sounds, as basic as that sounds, that is incredibly powerful. Another thing that I have noticed about SEO over the years, going back to this idea of it's still so incredibly underinvested as a category, given its scale potential, high margin, high intent, all of these things. The thing that I've noticed, in these boardrooms with, C-suite kinds of folks is that most of the way that SEO is talked about amongst us and practitioners, we might as well be speaking Japanese.
Yeah.
Like all of the technical stuff, not only is it not helpful, it actively hurts your ability to bring those people, to educate them and bring them on board with you, because the higher you go up in a very large, successful organization, by the time you are some, high level person, some C-suite in some big public company, you don't get there by publicly not knowing stuff, right? And sitting in a room talking to an SEO consultant who's speaking Japanese to you, it makes those executives feel stupid. It makes them feel stupid, and nobody likes feeling that way. And so it's just easier to say, oh God, this is this complicated thing that has high overhead and a long time cycle to deliver.
Sounds risky with all those algorithm updates too that you keep talking about. Wow, I don't even know if I can trust this as a long-term thing.
And so that emotional reaction, I think, is a very real, it exerts a real braking effect on the momentum that you can have in those kinds of rooms, because it's intimidating. They're afraid they're going to look stupid, and they have no interest in looking stupid.
It's the safe bet is the status quo. It's the fear of fucking up. And I think that is like so important in understanding how people make decisions. So I'll tell you like a little bit of our experience because we work on both sides of the spectrum with like these incredibly large B2B brands and then these startups. And in my experience working on the strategies, like the early stage companies are so hard to build a smart strategy for. You're like sifting through like thousands or hundreds of thousands of keywords trying to find something that relates to their product that they can actually compete for. And it's like, it's very difficult. And then they don't have the resources to accomplish it. And it's the strategy part is difficult, but getting it pushed through is very easy because they're just like, yeah, do it for sure.
Yep.
It's the opposite of big companies. Like when I do an audit or like an opportunity sizing, I'm like, internally, like there's so much dopamine going off because I'm like, I've never seen an opportunity like this. This is crazy. You can literally just like keyword. Like it's so much opportunity, but then like it's selling it through and like there's alignment. And in my experience, like at some of these companies, there's incredibly intelligent people who do know better, but they're having trouble getting buy-in and like they're on one team or business unit. And, if it's just them, they're not going to get the stakeholder alignment they need. So they need to convince all the other business units and then they need to get buy-in from their boss. And with a couple of these, what I found is oftentimes it comes because they're heavily reliant on paid acquisition. And they get to this point where they're so frustrated. They're like, we can't just keep doing this. So our results aren't getting better. It's getting more expensive. It's actually like our results are diminishing. So they reach this point. And to convince, I found two, these are more tactical, but pulling in competition. I found executives love and hate seeing like where they are in relation to their top competitors. So if you're like, here's a Y and X axis and it's like, here's where you are and here's your three competitors and they're way ahead of you.
Eyes get real big. Yes.
They love it. It's like easy to understand. It triggers that like FOMO, like, oh, I should be doing this too thing. That's the emotional play. And then on the paid reliance, if you can, it might be hard to relate it to revenue or whatever, depending on, like, it's enterprise B2B for us. So it's really hard to approximate that.
Yeah.
But if we could just say like the earned media value and say like, oh, this is how much it would cost if you were to pay for this. And you're already spending this many millions on paid. So like, you could still do both, but like, here's what it would be worth.
Yeah.
Right. So those have been kind of effective things we found for just selling at the upper levels, more of the executive level at these companies. But that part is like 80% of the work with these companies.
Yeah. No, I think that's really smart. Like, because another thing that you're saying is that you're taking the impact of SEO out of this sort of arcane level of technical stuff that's a little bit intimidating. And you're just re-expressing the benefits in a language that they understand, right? If it's like, if it is a company that thinks about how they build their brand in terms of GRP, you could talk about the number of brand impressions that SEO is going to deliver as your customers inevitably research you and your category, and just getting that brand exposure and relating that to something like, hey, you're spending this money to get these kinds of GRPs, and here's a benefit to your organic search exposure that you're probably not even thinking about, right? That starts to bring it into a realm that they feel comfortable in, and I think you're likely to get much better results off it.
So the other part of that question or your tweet was this just a general idea, which I think is contrarian in some circles now, about SEO being underinvested in.
Yeah.
I don't know if these were your words, but underrated.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of chatter nowadays, especially like you had mentioned LLMs, and people are thrilled about the potential to go, viral or build organic audiences on social. LinkedIn is the big one. Is SEO still underrated at this point?
Absolutely. I was working with a huge multinational software company, and they were spending all of this money on an external agency that was managing all of their paid search. And they had an internal SEO team. And I just, like, from arm's length, it just didn't seem like they were doing a whole lot. And so I helped the company and I helped them redo their strategy around conversion rate optimization and how they were going to drive lead volume into all their B2B software products. And that did really well. And that sort of gave me a good relationship with the VP marketing. I asked her, I was like, so, we're doing all this work on the paid side. I don't see a lot of stuff going on the, on the organic side. What's going on there? And her answer was, well, yeah, I just don't have a lot of confidence in that. And so I dig a little bit deeper. I was like, well, maybe I could explain SEO to you in a way that might help you put some context around some things. And I literally just sat down with her, and, I've sort of developed this very simple stepwise approach for explaining SEO, especially to executives at large companies. Broke it down, very simple, just walked her through piece by piece, 20-minute discussion. At the end of the discussion, she reached across the table. She put her hand on my arm. She was like, Ethan, I just learned more about SEO in 20 minutes with you than I have in 5 years talking to my internal SEO team, right? And I literally think that's not because I was doing anything magical. It's because I believe that we as an industry have a tremendous opportunity in figuring out how to simplify how we articulate what SEO is, what the opportunity is, what it can do for businesses. And that simplification, frankly, reduces the anxiety of those senior executives. It makes them feel confident and comfortable discussing some of the big topics because they sort of understand how some of the big pieces move around. And to me, that is a way to break the log jam that you see in large organizations that maybe even have an in-house SEO capacity, but they're not using it very well. breaking it down and communicating about it in a very simple way for me has been extremely powerful. And I think that this also points to a bit of I would almost call it like a perverse incentive in the SEO industry. Because for me, when I look at people who build really successful careers in SEO and they're very high profile and you see them out and they're talking at all the conferences and all this kind of stuff, the general pattern seems to be you build your career in the SEO industry by beating the smartest person in the room, looking at a problem in a completely novel way, getting really into some obscure technical details and maybe understanding some of the mechanisms behind this. And for, career-long SEO search nerds, like, I love that stuff. Mike King launches his 20-page blog post. I'm going to read the whole thing, right? It's awesome for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But that level of technical depth and specificity, not only is it not helpful to non-SEOs, I think it's actively unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes SEO look like an unapproachable field.
Yep.
Right? To this day, I still hear companies, even big companies, talking about their frustrations in working in the SEO field and how they're like, that there's just these few people that you can ask that have the information. And it's sort of like they're these high priests and you have to go to the high priest and hope that they bless you. And then you can take that information. And I just don't think that actually represents reality. I think that instead of not instead of, but in addition to our industry promoting these really innovative, incredibly smart, incredibly technical thought leaders, I think the other end of that barbell is there is huge opportunity in figuring out how to communicate SEO, especially for large enterprises, in a way that they can understand.
I love this because I wanted to talk to you about this too. Are you familiar with the midwit meme?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's my favorite meme. Yeah. And I reference it all the time on this podcast. It's like IQ bell curve for the audience, dumb one and smart one, super simplified. Midwit is like frustrated and they've got this long, chaotic, complex explanation. And that's what it sort of reminds me of. So I've seen stuff on LinkedIn where people, and I think they're well-meaning, like they want to basically aggrandize their field and it makes them feel more valued. They maybe feel undervalued, but it's doing the opposite, as you mentioned. But they'll be like, oh, content is just SEO is just content and links and technical. What about, and then they'll list like 100 things that are like super technical and esoteric. And I'm like, come on. And it reminds me, because I know you're into health and wellness and fitness. I read papers for fun. I read medical papers for fun.
Right on.
I listen to Andrew Huberman. Like I'm really in the weeds on all this stuff. And I'm like looking at the cutting edge supplements and shit. But if you want to get somebody off the couch and like exercising, you don't feed them that. You say like, consume fewer calories than you burn and like walk more. Yeah. Like the simplest thing that you can actually just get started. It's like the more information you load them with, the more paralysis comes with that.
Absolutely.
You see it all over. CRO, it's the same thing in that space. It's like executive wants to hear experimentation makes money. They don't hear all the stuff in the middle, you know?
Yeah. I definitely relate to that. I'm always focused. Like I came across this thing on a podcast once upon a time, and apparently Einstein proposed 5 different levels of intelligence, and at the very base of that was you're smart, you're a smart person. A level above that, you're intelligent. A level above that, you're brilliant. A level above that, you're a genius, and the level above that is simple. Right? Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And so if you can get to that point where you can acknowledge the technical complexity, but abstract it to a level of simplicity for your audience, I just think it's incredibly, incredibly powerful. And I'm not sure I'm not sure that we really do a great job of that as the industry because, again, I think the way you build your career is in the opposite direction, more technical, more complex, more complicated.
I'm going to have to get you on another episode, and we're going to have to play that simplicity card and try to unpack some things. Like technical SEO is an area I wanted to get into.
Yeah.
But I just think that's such a wonderful area to wrap up, and we're coming up on time anyway. So
Right.
I'll give you do you want to, point people anywhere online? Where can people find you? Anything else you wanted to add here?
Yeah, sure. So on Twitter, I'm at Ethan Hayes. Obviously, I'm the general manager of Moz.com and GetStat.com, which is stat search analytics. You can find me in any of those places.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
Pleasure talking to you, Alex.